The chlorinated water erupted in a splash that sent droplets cascading across the tile deck as Brandon Ashworth's expensive leather loafers skidded on the wet surface, his designer polo shirt soaked through, and the smug expression that had dominated his face for 3 years at Riverside Preparatory Academy finally crumbled into something resembling panic. The underwater ROV unit he'd just thrown into the pool, the science project that belonged to that scholarship kid, that nobody from nowhere, was not sinking. It was not sparking. It was not dying. Instead, its LED lights blinked methodically in the crystalline water. Its propellers whirred to life, and the device began executing its programmed underwater survey pattern with mechanical precision, while 50 students, 3 teachers, and 2 competition judges watched from the pool deck. Brandon's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on land, and for the first time in his entitled life, he's understood what it felt like to be utterly, completely, publicly destroyed by his own arrogance. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know was that their target had spent 2 years learning marine robotics from his father, a Navy veteran who'd taught him that the best defense against sabotage is preparation, discipline, and building things so well that they turn your enemy's attacks into demonstrations of your own excellence. Subscribe now to witness how one waterproof science project became the weapon that dismantled a kingdom of cruelty and exposed the corrupt systems that had protected the worst kind of privilege for far too long. But let's rewind to where it all began. The Greyhound bus exhaled diesel fumes into the humid August air as it pulled away from the station on Franklin Street, leaving Marcus Chen standing on cracked pavement with 2 duffel bags, a cardboard box, and the weight of his mother's final instructions pressing against his chest like a physical thing. The town of Riverside looked exactly like every other small Connecticut community that existed in the gravitational pull of old money. Brick storefronts with hand-painted signs, a town green with a Civil War monument, and streets lined with maples that had witnessed 100 years of the same families ruling the same institutions with the same indifference to anyone outside their circle. Marcus adjusted his grip on the box that held his most precious possession, the partially assembled components of his underwater remotely operated vehicle, and started the 3-mile walk to the apartment his mother had secured sight unseen through a church connection. The August sun beat down on his black hair, and sweat traced paths down his spine beneath the thrift store backpack that held everything else he owned in the world. His mother had taken the morning shift at the hospital in Hartford, 40 minutes away by bus, because it paid $2 more per hour than the evening shift. And those $2 multiplied by 5 days, multiplied by 52 weeks, meant the difference between making rent or falling behind. Marcus understood economics the way rich kids understood trust funds, as an inescapable reality that shaped every decision. At 15 years old, he'd already learned that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you carried yourself through spaces designed to remind you that you didn't belong. The apartment was exactly what he'd expected from the photos. A 2-bedroom unit above a dry cleaner, its windows rattling slightly in their frames. The linoleum in the kitchen cracked in geometric patterns that resembled a dried riverbed. But it had a kitchen table where he could study, a 2nd bedroom for his mother, and a bathroom with water pressure that suggested functional plumbing, which was more than they'd had in 3 of their previous places. Marcus set down his bags and immediately unpacked the ROV components, laying them out on the kitchen table with the reverence of a surgeon arranging instruments. The project had started 18 months ago, back when they'd lived near the naval base in Rhode Island, back when his father had still been stateside between deployments. Commander James Chen had taught his son that the ocean was humanity's next frontier, that the skills to explore it would be valuable currency in a world where 95% of the seafloor remained unmapped. He'd brought home discarded sensors from the base, shown Marcus how to waterproof electronics with marine epoxy, explained the physics of neutral buoyancy and the programming logic required to navigate three-dimensional underwater space. Then had come the training accident, the closed casket, and the flag that now sat folded in a shadow box in Marcus's duffel bag. The ROV had become more than a science project. It was a conversation with his father that Marcus refused to let end. He spent the rest of that August day assembling the frame, checking connections and programming navigation algorithms while his mother unpacked boxes and tried to transform generic apartment walls into something resembling home. She'd hung the shadow box in the living room where it caught the afternoon light, and Marcus watched her touch it gently before moving to the kitchen. Lisa Chen had been an ER nurse for 20 years, and she had the kind of tired eyes that came from witnessing human suffering on 12-hour shifts. But she smiled when she saw Marcus hunched over his project, his fingers moving with the precision his father had drilled into him. She made them dinner from pantry staples, rice and eggs and frozen vegetables, and they ate at the table surrounded by circuit boards and waterproof housing materials. She asked about his plans for the project, and Marcus explained how he intended to create an affordable underwater inspection tool that could be deployed in harbors and marinas to check hull integrity, pier foundations, and environmental contamination. The competition he'd found online, the Regional STEM Innovation Fair, had a first-place prize of $5,000 and potential scholarship opportunities. Lisa Chen had learned to be skeptical of potential and possibility. But she looked at her son and saw the same stubborn determination that had defined his father. So she told him she believed in him and made him promise to find friends at his new school and to not let grief consume him the way it had threatened to consume her. The night before school started, Marcus walked the route from apartment to campus, timing it at 23 minutes at a steady pace. Riverside Preparatory Academy sat on 40 acres of manicured grounds, its brick buildings arranged around a quad that looked like it belonged in a college brochure. The main gate bore a bronze plaque that announced the school's founding in 1887 by industrialist families whose surnames still appeared on half the buildings in town. Marcus stood at that gate, in the darkness, looking at the illuminated windows where security lights revealed wood-paneled hallways and oil paintings of stern-faced men in 19th-century suits. He'd earned his place here through test scores that had shocked even his teachers, through an essay about resilience that had made the scholarship committee weep, through his father's military service record that checked a diversity box the school needed to maintain its nonprofit status. He was one of 43 scholarship students in a population of 600, and he knew before walking through those gates that he would be marked as an outsider, a charity case, someone who'd have to work twice as hard to receive half the credit. But Commander James Chen had taught his son that the Navy didn't care about your bank account or your last name when you were 200 feet underwater with a hull breach. It cared about competence, discipline, and grace under pressure. Marcus carried those lessons like armor. The first day arrived with September sunshine that made the quad look like something from a prep school recruiting video. Marcus wore khakis from Goodwill and a polo shirt his mother had bought on clearance, and he walked through those bronze gates at 7:40 in the morning with his schedule printed on paper because he didn't own a smartphone. The other students flowed around him in designer clothes and casual arrogance, their conversations peppered with references to summer homes in the Hamptons and family trips to Europe. They carried MacBooks and wore Apple Watches and moved through space with the confidence of people who'd never worried about whether they could afford lunch. Marcus found his locker, memorized its combination on the first try, and organized his textbooks with military efficiency. His first class was AP Chemistry with Dr. Patricia Morrison, a white-haired woman who'd been teaching for 30 years and had the classroom management skills of a drill sergeant. She assigned seats alphabetically, which meant Marcus ended up in the third row between Christine Matthews and David Newsom, both of whom gave him the kind of brief, assessing glance that calculated his social value in microseconds before dismissing him as irrelevant. Dr. Morrison launched into a discussion of molecular structures and reaction kinetics, and Marcus took notes in neat handwriting, while half the class scrolled through Instagram on their phones hidden beneath their desks. When Dr. Morrison asked a question about electronegativity that was met with silence, Marcus raised his hand and provided an answer that referenced both the Pauling scale and quantum mechanical models, and the teacher's eyebrows rose in something resembling interest. Christine Matthews turned to look at him again, this time with curiosity rather than dismissal, but David Newsom's expression had curdled into something hostile. Lunch was a revelation in economic disparity. The cafeteria at Riverside Prep featured multiple stations including a sushi bar, a made-to-order pasta station, and a salad bar that looked like something from an upscale grocery store. Students paid with student ID cards linked to family accounts, swiping casually for $12 meals without glancing at prices. Marcus had packed a lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a water bottle, and he found an empty table near the windows where he could eat alone and study the social dynamics playing out around him. The cafeteria had an invisible geography, tables claimed by unspoken rules that separated seniors from juniors, athletes from artists, the wealthy from the merely privileged. At the center of this solar system sat a table of seniors who radiated the kind of casual power that comes from generations of inherited confidence. They wore their uniforms like costume suggestions rather than requirements. Untucked shirts, loosened ties, rolled sleeves that suggested rules were for other people. At the center of this group sat Brandon Ashworth, a senior with the kind of sculpted features that came from good genetics and expensive orthodontics, his dirty blonde hair styled in calculated carelessness that probably required 20 minutes and $50 worth of product. He said something that made his table laugh, a sound that carried across the cafeteria like a proclamation of dominance, and Marcus recognized the type immediately. The apex predator who'd learned young that power wasn't something you earned, but something you took and defended. The afternoon brought American history with Mr. Gerald Foster, who spent more time discussing his golf game than the progressive era, and calculus with Ms. Jennifer Yang, who actually seemed invested in teaching. Marcus excelled in both classes, his hand rising when others looked blank, his answers revealing understanding rather than rote memorization. By the end of the day, he'd established himself as academically formidable, socially invisible, and thoroughly uninterested in the social hierarchies that consumed most of his peers. He walked home through streets lined with houses that cost more than his mother would earn in a lifetime, past lawns maintained by invisible labor, past driveways holding vehicles worth more than 2 years of hospital nursing wages. The apartment felt smaller after seeing the privilege on display all day, but it was theirs, and his mother would be home by midnight, and his ROV components waited on the kitchen table like a promise that excellence could exist independent of wealth. He spent the evening coding navigation subroutines, testing waterproof seals, and integrating sensors that would allow his device to collect water quality data while performing structural inspections. The work required patience and precision, qualities his father had taught him on 1,000 quiet evenings when other kids had been playing video games or watching television. Marcus had learned to find meditation in exactitude, peace in the pursuit of perfection, strength in the knowledge that his value came from what he could create rather than what he could buy. The first week passed in a blur of note-taking and calculated anonymity. Marcus learned the rhythms of Riverside Prep, where the scholarship kids congregated during free periods, which bathrooms were safe versus which ones were claimed territory for social warfare, how to navigate the unwritten rules that governed interactions between the economic classes. He made allies carefully, drawn to other outsiders who valued competence over pedigree. There was Destiny Rodriguez, a Latina scholarship student whose parents owned a bodega in Hartford and who tutored other students in calculus while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. There was Kevin Park, a Korean-American sophomore whose family had moved to Riverside for his father's factory job, and who played chess with the intensity of someone who understood strategic thinking. They formed a loose alliance, eating lunch together, sharing notes, existing in the spaces between the established social structures. Destiny had warned him about Brandon Ashworth during their second lunch together, explaining how the Ashworth family owned half the commercial real estate in town, how Brandon's father sat on the school board, and his mother chaired the scholarship committee, how Brandon had a history of targeting scholarship students and facing zero consequences because his family's donations kept the school financially stable. Marcus had listened and filed the information away, recognizing that knowledge of your adversary was the first step in defending yourself against them. The confrontation happened in week 2, sudden and inevitable as a chemical reaction. Marcus was walking from the library to his locker when he encountered Brandon Ashworth and his entourage blocking the hallway. There were 4 of them, Brandon plus Tyler Morrison, Chase Blackwell, and Jeremy Caldwell, all seniors, all from families whose names appeared on buildings and endowments. They wore matching letter jackets from sports teams they'd bought their way onto, and they had the loose-limbed confidence of young men who'd never faced meaningful consequences. Brandon looked at Marcus the way someone might examine an insect, curious and vaguely disgusted, and then he smiled with teeth that had cost more than Marcus's mother's car. He asked if Marcus was enjoying his charity education, if he'd figured out where the scholarship kids were supposed to eat lunch, if he understood that academic achievement meant nothing without the social capital to leverage it. His tone was friendly, almost conversational, but his eyes were cold and calculating, measuring Marcus for weaknesses. Tyler Morrison laughed and suggested maybe Marcus should thank the Ashworth family personally for their generous donations that made his enrollment possible. Marcus stood absolutely still, his backpack straps gripped in hands that didn't shake, his expression neutral, and he looked at Brandon for a long moment before responding in a voice that carried no anger, no fear, just simple factual observation. He said that he'd earned his place through merit, that his test scores were in the 99th percentile, and that his presence enriched the school far more than any financial donation. Then he stepped around Brandon and continued down the hallway, leaving the 4 seniors standing in stunned silence at the sheer audacity of refusing to be intimidated. The retaliation started small. Marcus's locker was vandalized with spray paint that said "Charity Case" in red letters, forcing him to clean it after school while campus security conveniently didn't review the security footage. His gym clothes disappeared from his locker and turned up in the trash compactor behind the cafeteria. Someone created a fake Instagram account called Poor Scholar that posted photos of Marcus with mocking captions about his clothes and his packed lunches and his walking to school instead of driving. The account gained 200 followers in 3 days before Destiny reported it and got it taken down. But the damage was done. Marcus had been marked publicly as a target, and the social hierarchy at Riverside Prep had established that he existed outside their protection. He responded by becoming even more academically excellent, raising his hand in every class, acing every test, and demonstrating the kind of disciplined brilliance that made teachers notice. Dr. Morrison asked him to stay after chemistry class one afternoon and invited him to enter the Regional STEM Innovation Fair, telling him that his grasp of applied science was the most sophisticated she'd seen in years of teaching. Marcus explained that he was already working on a project, an underwater ROV with environmental monitoring capabilities, and Dr. Morrison's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent decades watching privilege triumph over talent. She became his faculty sponsor, offering to order specialized components through the school's supplier accounts, to book time in the engineering lab, to connect him with marine biology professors at the local community college. For the first time since his father's death, Marcus felt the presence of an adult who believed in his potential not as charity, but as recognition of his capabilities. Brandon Ashworth's response to Marcus's increasing visibility was predictably escalatory. In late September, Marcus arrived at school to find his bike, a 20-year-old Schwinn that had belonged to his father, vandalized beyond repair, its frame bent, its wheels twisted, and "scholarships can't buy respect" keyed into the paint. The security footage mysteriously malfunctioned during the relevant hours. Marcus reported the incident to Principal Edward Whitmore, a silver-haired administrator who'd held his position for 15 years through careful navigation of donor relationships. Whitmore listened with the expression of someone performing a ritual rather than seeking justice, made sympathetic noises about random vandalism and teenage pranks, and suggested that Marcus might be more careful about where he secured his property. When Marcus pointed out that the bike had been locked in the designated student lot, Whitmore's sympathy evaporated into something sharper, and he suggested that scholarship students needed to understand that they were guests at Riverside Prep, that their presence was a privilege rather than a right, and that making waves about minor incidents could jeopardize their enrollment. Marcus understood in that moment that the corruption at Riverside Prep wasn't aberrant but systemic, that Principal Whitmore was less an educator than a fundraiser who understood that protecting Brandon Ashworth meant protecting the family donations that underwrote his own salary. He thanked the principal politely, left the office, and walked 3 miles home that afternoon, carrying his damaged bike on his shoulders like a cross, his jaw set in the kind of grim determination that his father would have recognized. His mother cried when she saw the bike, not just because it had been James Chen's, but because she understood what the vandalism represented. A declaration that her son would never be safe in spaces dominated by old money and older prejudices. She wanted to withdraw him from Riverside Prep, to enroll him in Hartford Public, where at least the violence would be honest, rather than wrapped in prep school politeness. But Marcus explained about Dr. Morrison, about the STEM fair, about how his ROV project could win scholarships that would let him attend MIT or Caltech or any engineering program in the country. He explained that running from bullies meant carrying fear forever, that his father had taught him to face challenges with discipline and preparation, that the best revenge against people like Brandon Ashworth was excellence so profound that it couldn't be denied or dismissed. Lisa Chen looked at her son and saw a young man who'd inherited his father's courage without his father's cynicism, and she agreed to let him stay at Riverside Prep on one condition: that he build a support network, that he connect with mentors who could provide the protection she couldn't afford to buy. Marcus promised, and he meant it, understanding that isolation was vulnerability, but community was armor. October brought cooler temperatures and escalating hostility. Brandon Ashworth had apparently decided that Marcus's continued presence represented a challenge to his dominance, and he approached the campaign against him with a kind of strategic thinking that wealthy sociopaths mistake for intelligence. The attacks became more sophisticated, more public, more designed to humiliate rather than simply harm. During a chemistry lab, someone, later identified as Tyler Morrison but never officially charged, contaminated Marcus's solution with sodium hydroxide, causing a minor explosion that sent caustic liquid across his lab station and earned him a 0 on the assignment, despite Dr. Morrison's protests to the administration. The official report blamed student error, despite security footage showing Tyler's approach to Marcus's station. During a required assembly in the auditorium, someone played a video on the school's projection system that showed Marcus's apartment building, his mother walking to the bus stop in her nurse's scrubs, and text that read, "This is who we're giving scholarships to while qualified students get waitlisted." The video played for 14 seconds before a teacher shut down the system, but 600 students had seen it, had seen Marcus's poverty exposed in high definition, had absorbed the message that his presence was charity rather than merit. Marcus sat through the remainder of the assembly with his back straight and his expression neutral, but inside he felt something fundamental shift. The last vestige of belief that Riverside Prep was a meritocracy died, replaced by cold understanding that this was war and that he'd been fighting with one hand tied behind his back by his own faith in institutional justice. What would you have done in Marcus's position? Continued to trust systems that had repeatedly failed to protect you? Or started building your own arsenal of evidence and allies? The question haunted him as autumn deepened and his ROV project progressed. He spent every afternoon in the engineering lab that Dr. Morrison had secured for him, assembling components with the precision his father had drilled into him through years of working on submarine systems together. The ROV was taking shape, a rectangular frame of PVC and aluminum holding 6 waterproofed motors, a forward-facing camera, multiple environmental sensors, and a navigation computer that Marcus had programmed himself using Python and ROS libraries. Every connection was sealed with marine epoxy, every wire routed through waterproof conduits, every component tested in the bathtub at home before being integrated into the final assembly. Dr. Morrison watched his progress with something like awe, remarking that most college engineering students couldn't produce work at this level of sophistication. She connected him with Professor David Walsh at Eastern Connecticut State University, a marine robotics researcher who reviewed Marcus's designs and declared them not just competition-worthy but potentially publishable in undergraduate research journals. Walsh became a mentor, spending hours explaining advanced concepts, lending Marcus textbooks on autonomous underwater vehicles, and writing him letters of recommendation for summer research programs. For the first time since his father's death, Marcus had an adult male figure who saw him as someone with potential, rather than someone who needed rescue. November arrived with bare trees and shortened days, and a sense that something was building toward a crisis. Brandon Ashworth's attacks had shifted from property damage to social destruction. He spread rumors that Marcus was cheating, that his test scores were impossible without answer keys stolen from teachers' desks, that his ROV project was actually built by his dead father, and Marcus was just claiming credit. The rumors infected the school like viruses, mutating with each retelling, until even teachers who'd praised Marcus's work began looking at him with skepticism. When Dr. Morrison confronted Whitmore about the atmosphere of harassment, the principal suggested that perhaps Marcus's aggressive academic performance made other students feel inadequate, that maybe he should consider toning down his participation in class discussions, that scholarship students had responsibilities to blend in rather than stand out. Dr. Morrison threatened to resign, to take the story to the local newspaper, to contact the state education board about Title VI violations, but Whitmore reminded her that she had 3 years until retirement, that her pension depended on those years, and that the Ashworth family's legal team had successfully buried more serious complaints than hers. She left his office shaking with rage and shame, and she told Marcus everything the following day, including the fact that she was choosing her pension over his protection. Marcus forgave her immediately because he understood how systems of power worked. They didn't just buy silence. They bought complicity from good people who had mortgages and medical bills, and futures that depended on not making waves. Thanksgiving week brought the incident that transformed Marcus's situation from hostile to dangerous. He was leaving campus after a late session in the engineering lab when Brandon and his crew cornered him in the parking lot. Far from cameras, in the darkness of a November evening at 6 p.m. There were 6 of them now, the original 4 plus 2 junior football players who'd been recruited for muscle. Brandon asked if Marcus had been working on his little science fair project, made mocking beeping sounds like a submarine, and then suggested they should take a look at what their tuition dollars were funding. Marcus understood immediately what was about to happen and positioned himself between them and the engineering building's door where his ROV was secured in Dr. Morrison's lab. Brandon smiled and explained that they didn't need to go inside. They'd already been inside during their free period that afternoon, and Marcus's project was currently in Brandon's BMW trunk, waiting to be returned in whatever condition Brandon decided was appropriate. The rage that Marcus had been suppressing for months rose like a tidal wave, and he felt his hands clench into fists, felt his body move into the fighting stance his father had taught him from Marine Corps hand-to-hand combat training, felt every muscle prepare for violence. But Commander James Chen's voice echoed in his memory. Discipline means choosing your battles, means never giving your enemy what they want, means understanding that righteous anger is useless if it results in your own destruction. Marcus forced his hands to unclench, forced his breathing to steady, and he looked at Brandon with an expression that the senior would later describe as fucking terrifying, and asked what Brandon wanted in exchange for the ROV's return. Brandon hadn't expected negotiation. He'd expected tears or violence, either of which would have given him the satisfaction he craved. He recovered quickly, though, and he explained that Marcus should withdraw from the STEM fair, should stop making teachers write him recommendation letters, should basically disappear back into the shadows where charity cases belonged. Marcus asked what guarantee he had that Brandon would return the ROV undamaged. Brandon laughed and said there were no guarantees, that this was a lesson in how the real world worked, that sometimes you had to trust people who had more power than you. Marcus nodded slowly, appearing to consider the proposition, and then he asked if Brandon had ever considered that theft was a felony, that Marcus's phone had been recording audio for the past 3 minutes, and that making terroristic threats against a minor was grounds for expulsion regardless of how much money your father donated. The color drained from Brandon's face. Tyler Morrison lunged forward to grab Marcus's phone, but Marcus was faster, already running, already out of reach. His father's training in battlefield awareness translating to the ability to know when retreat was tactics rather than cowardice. He made it to the street before they could catch him, and he spent the 3-mile walk home checking constantly to see if Brandon's BMW was following. His heart pounding not from exertion but from the realization that he'd just escalated the conflict beyond any possible peaceful resolution. The recording changed everything because it was evidence, and evidence had power that even Ashworth money couldn't completely neutralize. Marcus spent that night duplicating the audio file, emailing it to himself, to Dr. Morrison, to his mother's account, to Professor Walsh, creating redundancy that would survive any attempts at suppression. His mother listened to the recording 3 times, her nurse's training making her calm in crises, and then she made calls to every legal aid society in Connecticut, while Marcus sat at the kitchen table trying to calculate the cost of materials needed to rebuild the ROV from scratch if Brandon destroyed the original. By morning, they had an appointment with Teresa Gonzalez, a civil rights attorney with Connecticut Legal Aid who specialized in educational discrimination cases. Gonzalez listened to the recording, and her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine anger. She explained that what the recording captured wasn't just bullying, but extortion, theft, and potentially assault if Marcus felt threatened. She drafted a letter to Principal Whitmore threatening a federal Title VI lawsuit unless the school took immediate action to protect Marcus and recover his property. The letter went out via certified mail on Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Brandon Ashworth had been called to Whitmore's office for a conversation that lasted 45 minutes and ended with the ROV being returned to Dr. Morrison's lab, apparently undamaged. Marcus inspected every component that evening after school, checking seals and connections and running diagnostic tests that would reveal any sabotage. Dr. Morrison stayed with him, her presence both supportive and guilty. And when Marcus declared the ROV intact, she asked him directly if he wanted her to testify against Whitmore, against the school, regardless of the cost to her pension. Marcus looked at this teacher, who'd been the only adult in the building to consistently protect him, and he told her no, that he'd find another way to fight, that he wouldn't make her sacrifice her security for his justice. She hugged him then. This white-haired woman embracing this Chinese-American boy whose father was dead and whose mother worked night shifts. And she whispered that the world was profoundly unfair, but that his excellence would eventually force it to bend. Marcus wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that merit would ultimately triumph, but he'd learned too much about power structures to have faith in eventual justice. He'd learned instead to trust preparation, documentation, and the kind of strategic thinking that turned defensive positions into offensive advantages. December arrived with snow and the approach of the STEM fair scheduled for December 15th at the Hartford Convention Center. Marcus spent every spare moment refining his ROV, adding features, perfecting the control software, and preparing a presentation that explained not just how the device worked, but why it mattered, how affordable underwater inspection tools could save municipalities millions in infrastructure repair costs, how environmental monitoring could provide early warning of contamination, how democratizing access to marine robotics could inspire a new generation of ocean explorers. Professor Walsh helped him rehearse the presentation, critiquing his slides and his delivery until Marcus could explain complex concepts in language accessible to judges with varied backgrounds. Dr. Morrison secured funding from the school's STEM budget to pay Marcus's registration fee, and she arranged transportation to Hartford on the day of the fair. The project was registered under Marcus's name with Riverside Prep, listed as his school, which meant that if he won, the school would get credit and publicity, a fact that made Whitmore suddenly very interested in Marcus's success, despite having ignored him for months. The principal called Marcus to his office to wish him luck, to remind him that he represented Riverside Prep, to suggest that a win would be good for the entire school community, including future scholarship students. Marcus listened politely and thought about how success magically transformed you from a liability into an asset, how institutions that had failed to protect you suddenly wanted to claim you once you'd survived on your own. Brandon Ashworth must have realized that Marcus winning the STEM fair would undermine everything Brandon had worked to establish, that the charity case would be publicly recognized as superior to the wealthy legacy students, that merit would triumph over privilege in a way that couldn't be dismissed or diminished. In the week before the fair, the harassment intensified to levels that suggested desperation rather than confidence. Someone broke into Marcus's locker and stole his presentation notes, forcing him to recreate them from memory. Someone hacked his email and deleted his correspondence with Professor Walsh, though Marcus recovered it from backup folders. Someone started a rumor that Marcus's father had been dishonorably discharged and that the whole military service story was a lie, a particularly cruel fabrication that made Marcus's mother call the school in tears, demanding retraction and apology. Whitmore issued a generic statement condemning rumors without identifying the source or imposing consequences, which meant the rumor persisted and metastasized. By December 14th, the day before the fair, Marcus existed in a state of exhausted vigilance, sleeping lightly, checking constantly for new attacks, preparing for sabotage that logic said was inevitable. The morning of December 15th dawned clear and cold, temperature barely above freezing. the kind of winter day that made breath visible and made metal sting when touched with bare hands. Marcus woke at 5 a.m. and performed his pre-competition checklist with military precision. Verify ROV components, check battery charges, confirm backup batteries, test control software, pack tools, pack spare parts, pack documentation. His mother made breakfast and watched him move through preparations with the same focused intensity his father had brought to pre-deployment tasks, and she understood that her son was going into battle armed with nothing but excellence and the belief that it might be enough. They drove to school in her Honda Civic at 6:30, picking up Dr. Morrison at her house, and by 7 a.m. they were loading the ROV into Morrison's Subaru for the drive to Hartford. The device sat in a custom-built padded case that Marcus had constructed from hardware store foam, secured with straps that prevented movement, protected like the precious cargo it represented. 2 years of work, dozens of all-nighters, a conversation with his dead father made tangible in aluminum and electronics and marine epoxy. The convention center parking lot was already filling when they arrived at 8 a.m. Cars disgorging students and parents and teachers carrying projects that represented thousands of hours of effort. Marcus registered at the check-in desk and received his table assignment, number 47 in the robotics division, located in Hall C near the demonstration pool. The demonstration pool was a critical detail because robotics judges expected to see devices operate in their intended environment, which meant Marcus's ROV would need to perform in front of evaluators rather than just being explained through slides and video. He set up his display with care, arranging his project board with photos and diagrams that explained the device's capabilities, positioning his laptop to show live camera feeds, and conducting final diagnostic tests that confirmed all systems were operational. Dr. Morrison brought him coffee and a breakfast sandwich, both of which he consumed mechanically while reviewing his presentation notes one final time. Professor Walsh arrived at 9 a.m., having driven from Willimantic to provide moral support, and he inspected the ROV with the practiced eye of someone who understood that the difference between good and excellent existed in details invisible to casual observation. He told Marcus that the work was exceptional, that the judges would be impressed, and that regardless of outcome, Marcus should be proud of what he'd accomplished. Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but pride felt premature. He'd learned that celebration before victory was an invitation for disappointment. The convention center filled with controlled chaos as competitors made final preparations and judges began their rounds. The STEM fair was organized into divisions: biology, chemistry, engineering, physics, environmental science, with multiple categories within each division. Marcus was competing in the robotics category of the engineering division, where 16 projects would be evaluated by a panel of 3 judges representing academia, industry, and government. The judges for his category were Dr. Helen Park from Yale's Engineering School, Robert Chen from a marine technology startup called Ocean Tech Solutions, and Commander Patricia Williams from the Coast Guard. Marcus watched them work through the first tables, noting their different styles. Dr. Park asked theoretical questions about design choices. Chen focused on commercial applications and cost analysis. Williams wanted to understand reliability and operational limitations. By 11 a.m., they'd reached table 42, which meant Marcus had 15 minutes to center himself, to transform nervousness into focused energy, to channel his father's lessons about performing under pressure. He closed his eyes and remembered sitting in their apartment in Rhode Island, his father explaining that fear was just adrenaline looking for direction, that the trick was to point it at the task rather than at the outcome, that excellence required being present in the moment rather than worried about the future. The judges reached his table at 11:17. Dr. Park introduced herself and her colleagues, and they examined his project board while Marcus stood at attention, hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that his mother would have recognized from his father's military bearing. Dr. Park asked about his design methodology, and Marcus explained his iterative approach, the failures he'd encountered and overcome, the resources he'd consulted including textbooks, research papers, and mentorship from Professor Walsh. Chen asked about cost, and Marcus produced a detailed breakdown showing that his ROV could be manufactured for under $800, compared to commercial alternatives that started at $5,000, that his design was deliberately modular to allow repairs without replacing entire assemblies, that his control software was open source and could be adapted by other students. Williams asked the question Marcus had been hoping for. Could he demonstrate the device? Marcus confirmed that he could, and the judges consulted their schedule and agreed to meet him at the demonstration pool at 1 p.m. for a full operational test. They moved to the next table, their expressions professionally neutral, and Marcus felt a mixture of relief and anticipation that would sustain him through the lunch break. Dr. Morrison insisted he eat lunch, physically walking him to the convention center cafeteria and purchasing him a sandwich and fruit that he barely tasted. Professor Walsh talked through likely demonstration scenarios, suggesting that Marcus should emphasize the ROV's autonomous capabilities and its sensor integration. His mother arrived at 12:30, having driven from Hartford after her shift ended, still in her scrubs, because she hadn't had time to change. She looked exhausted and proud and terrified, and Marcus hugged her and promised that whatever happened, they'd be okay, that this was just one competition and not their entire future. She smiled and told him his father would have been proud, and Marcus felt emotions rising that he couldn't afford to process. Not now, not while he needed to be focused and professional. They walked together to the demonstration pool, a rectangular tank 20 feet long and 8 feet deep, with viewing windows on 3 sides and a small operations deck on the 4th. Several other robotics competitors were waiting their turn, and Marcus took his position in line, while his mother and Dr. Morrison found spots in the viewing area where spectators could watch demonstrations. At 12:55, Brandon Ashworth walked into Hall C. He wasn't alone. Tyler Morrison, Chase Blackwell, and Jeremy Caldwell flanked him like an honor guard, all 4 wearing Riverside Prep letter jackets and expressions that suggested they'd come to watch something entertaining. Marcus spotted them immediately, his situational awareness honed by months of tracking potential threats, and he felt his chest constrict with the understanding that Brandon hadn't given up, that whatever sabotage had been planned was about to be executed. Dr. Morrison saw them too and moved to intercept, positioning herself between Marcus and the group. But Brandon raised his hands in mock surrender and explained that they'd come to support their classmate, that Principal Whitmore had encouraged school spirit, that they just wanted to watch Marcus represent Riverside Prep. Morrison looked skeptical, but couldn't find grounds to eject them without causing a scene, and she retreated to the viewing area while keeping her eyes locked on Brandon's group. Marcus forced himself to focus on his pre-demonstration checklist, running through connection protocols and battery levels, refusing to let Brandon's presence disrupt his preparation. At exactly 1 p.m., Commander Williams approached and told him the judges were ready. Marcus carried his ROV to the operations deck and set it at the edge of the pool, while the judges positioned themselves around the viewing windows. He explained that he'd demonstrate 3 capabilities: manual control for precision navigation, autonomous operation using computer vision and SLAM algorithms, and environmental monitoring through integrated sensors. He powered up the device, confirmed that the control link was stable, and gently lowered it into the water. The ROV descended smoothly, its 6 motors making minor adjustments to maintain position against the water currents created by the pool's circulation system. Marcus piloted it through a series of turns and depth changes, narrating his actions and explaining the control logic. Through the viewing windows, The judges watched the camera feed on his laptop while simultaneously observing the actual device. Dr. Park asked him to demonstrate obstacle avoidance, so Marcus initiated autonomous mode and watched as his ROV navigated toward a set of PVC pipes arranged at the pool bottom, its sensors detecting the obstacles and routing around them while maintaining its programmed depth. The demonstration was going perfectly, better than any practice run, and Marcus felt something like hope beginning to bloom in his chest. That's when Brandon Ashworth pushed him into the pool. It happened in the gap between conscious thought and physical reaction, in that microsecond where the body moves before the brain processes. Brandon had been edging closer during the demonstration, positioning himself just behind Marcus and to the left, and when Marcus leaned forward to adjust the laptop angle, Brandon's hand shot out and shoved hard between Marcus's shoulder blades. Marcus fell forward, his arms windmilling uselessly, his face registering shock that shifted instantly to grim acceptance, and he hit the water chest first, with a splash that sent waves across the pool surface. The demonstration ROV, still in autonomous mode, was directly beneath him when he fell, and Marcus's flailing body collided with it on his descent into the chlorinated depths. The viewing area erupted in gasps and shouts. Dr. Morrison screamed Brandon's name. Lisa Chen started toward the pool deck. The judges stood frozen in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened and whether it was part of the demonstration. Marcus surfaced sputtering, his clothes soaked, his hair plastered to his skull, and his first thought wasn't for himself, but for his ROV, which had tumbled through the water when he'd collided with it and was now sinking toward the pool bottom at an uncontrolled angle. Brandon stood at the pool edge with an expression of theatrical surprise, his hands over his mouth, and he said very loudly so that everyone could hear, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I tripped. I didn't mean to." But his eyes were bright with triumph, and Tyler Morrison was barely suppressing a smile, and Marcus understood that this had been the plan all along, to sabotage the demonstration in a way that looked like an accident, to destroy Marcus's ROV in front of the judges, to ensure that even if Marcus won, his victory would be tainted by the humiliation of being pushed into a pool like a child. What Brandon didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every component of Marcus's ROV had been designed and tested for underwater operation, that the device could handle impacts and tumbles and uncontrolled descents, because Marcus had spent 2 years learning from his father that the ocean was unforgiving and that anything operating in it needed to be robust enough to survive worst-case scenarios. The ROV hit the pool bottom at an angle, rolled twice, and then its navigation system kicked in. The motors whined as they adjusted thrust. The device rotated itself back to horizontal orientation, and the forward camera resumed its programmed survey pattern as if nothing had happened. Marcus treaded water and watched through the viewing windows as his creation demonstrated a level of resilience that hadn't been part of his prepared presentation, but was infinitely more impressive than anything he'd planned to show. The autonomous system detected that it was off course and initiated a return-to-station protocol, piloting itself back to the location where Marcus had been standing when he fell. The judges watched with expressions that shifted from concern to fascination to something like awe. Dr. Park actually started laughing, a surprised, delighted sound. And she said to her colleagues, "Did you see that recovery? The stabilization algorithm is remarkable." Chen was taking notes frantically, already calculating the commercial applications of a ROV that could survive and recover from collisions without human intervention. Williams looked from the ROV to Marcus, who was now climbing the ladder out of the pool, and she smiled with the kind of respect that military personnel reserve for those who demonstrate grace under pressure. Marcus stood on the deck, dripping chlorinated water, his presentation ruined, his clothes soaked, his dignity apparently shredded in front of 50 witnesses. But then Commander Williams said, "Son, I've been evaluating robotics projects for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened. Your device didn't just survive a catastrophic impact. It recovered autonomously and resumed operation. That's not a science fair project. That's commercial-grade engineering." Dr. Park nodded vigorously and asked if the collision had been staged, if Marcus had planned to demonstrate impact resistance. Marcus looked at Brandon, who was now backing away from the pool deck with an expression that suggested he'd realized something had gone terribly wrong with his sabotage attempt. Marcus could have explained what really happened, could have accused Brandon in front of the judges and spectators, could have sought immediate justice. Instead, he smiled, that same terrifying, calm smile he'd used in the parking lot weeks earlier, and he said, "The collision was unplanned, but I designed every component to military specifications because my father taught me that the most important feature of any underwater system is the ability to survive and recover from failures. I'm glad I could demonstrate that resilience under real-world conditions." The judges spent 15 more minutes examining the ROV, which Marcus had retrieved from the pool and was drying off with towels provided by convention center staff. They asked increasingly technical questions about waterproofing techniques, about the navigation algorithm's ability to reorient after displacement, about the structural design that had prevented damage during impact. Marcus answered each question with the confidence of someone who'd built every component himself, who understood every line of code and every engineering decision, who'd learned from a father that excellence meant preparing for disasters rather than hoping they wouldn't happen. Dr. Morrison brought him a change of clothes from her car, a Riverside Prep sweatshirt and athletic pants that the school provided for students who needed them, a small irony that Marcus didn't miss. He changed in the bathroom and returned to his table to discover that a small crowd had gathered, other competitors and their families who'd heard about the incident and wanted to see the ROV that had survived a catastrophic collision without missing a beat. Professor Walsh was beaming and explained that he'd captured video of the entire incident, including Brandon's shove, and that the footage showed clearly that the collision hadn't been staged, but also that Marcus had built something genuinely exceptional. Lisa Chen hugged her son and whispered that his father had definitely been watching, had definitely been proud, and that sometimes the best victories came from turning sabotage into opportunity. The judges completed their rounds and retired to deliberate at 3 p.m. The award ceremony was scheduled for 5 p.m., which left 2 hours of anxious waiting, during which Marcus tried to distract himself by examining other projects and talking with fellow competitors. Several students approached to ask about his ROV, and Marcus found himself giving impromptu demonstrations and explaining design principles to teenagers who looked at him with respect rather than dismissal. Brandon and his crew had vanished, presumably recognizing that their presence would invite questions about the pool incident that they didn't want to answer. Dr. Morrison spent the waiting period making phone calls, and Marcus later learned she'd contacted Principal Whitmore to report Brandon's behavior and to demand immediate disciplinary action. Whitmore had apparently tried to dismiss the incident as a clumsy accident until Morrison mentioned that multiple witnesses and video footage contradicted that characterization, at which point he'd agreed to schedule a meeting for Monday morning. Whether he'd actually follow through with consequences was an open question, but Morrison's willingness to fight for Marcus, even at risk to her pension, represented a shift in the institutional dynamics that had previously protected Brandon's cruelty. At 4:45, the judges filed back into Hall C and positioned themselves at the front of the space near a small stage that had been erected for the awards ceremony. Competitors and their supporters filled the chairs facing the stage. Several hundred people representing months of work and thousands of hours of effort. Marcus sat with his mother and Dr. Morrison and Professor Walsh, his hands folded in his lap, his expression neutral, even though his heart was pounding against his ribs. The ceremony began with speeches from the fair organizers, acknowledgments of sponsors, and generic encouragements about how all participants were winners, regardless of awards. Then they began announcing category winners, starting with the biology division and working through chemistry and physics. The engineering division came last, with subcategories for different specialties. The robotics category was announced at 5:23, and Marcus felt time slow as the senior judge, Dr. Park, stepped to the microphone. She explained that the robotics category had featured exceptional work this year, that the judges had struggled to differentiate between several outstanding projects, but that one entry had demonstrated not just technical sophistication, but also the kind of robust design that distinguished professional engineering from academic exercises. She described a project that had integrated advanced sensors with autonomous navigation, that had demonstrated cost-effective manufacturing while maintaining commercial-grade performance, and that had proven its resilience under unplanned real-world conditions. Marcus's name echoed through the convention center speakers, and for a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't process, couldn't believe that preparation and discipline and his father's lessons had actually been enough to overcome money and privilege and systematic sabotage. Dr. Morrison was crying, and Lisa Chen was pulling him to his feet, and Professor Walsh was shaking his hand, and then Marcus was walking to the stage in a daze while several hundred people applauded, and Dr. Park handed him a trophy and an envelope containing a check for $5,000 and letters of congratulation from the fair sponsors, including scholarship opportunities at 3 different universities. Dr. Park leaned in as she shook his hand and said quietly, "I looked you up after the demonstration. I know about Riverside Prep. I know about the Ashworth family, and I know what that push into the pool was really about. What happened today wasn't just good engineering. It was poetic justice. Don't let anyone take this away from you." Marcus thanked her, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him, and he returned to his seat carrying a trophy that weighed maybe 3 pounds, but felt like vindication made tangible. The ceremony continued with awards in other categories, but Marcus barely processed them, his mind racing through implications and next steps, and the understanding that this victory would change the dynamics at Riverside Prep in ways both liberating and dangerous. Brandon Ashworth had tried to destroy him and had instead provided the perfect demonstration of resilience that had impressed the judges. The irony was so perfect that it felt scripted, but Marcus knew that luck had nothing to do with it. This was preparation meeting opportunity. This was his father's wisdom translated into action. This was what happened when you built things so well that sabotage became advertising. The drive back to Riverside was jubilant and anxious in equal measure. Dr. Morrison insisted on stopping for dinner, treating them to a meal at a diner where Marcus finally felt comfortable enough to eat without his stomach threatening rebellion. Professor Walsh explained that the letters in Marcus's award packet included invitations to summer research programs at MIT and Stanford, full scholarships that would let him work with leaders in marine robotics and would position him for admission to top engineering schools. Lisa Chen held her son's hand across the diner table and told him that his father had known this day would come, had believed that Marcus's combination of intelligence and character would eventually force the world to recognize what he was capable of achieving. Marcus felt the weight of the trophy in his backpack and understood that this was a beginning rather than an ending, that Brandon Ashworth wouldn't simply accept defeat, that Monday would bring consequences he couldn't fully predict. But for one evening, sitting in a diner with people who believed in him, Marcus let himself feel the satisfaction of earned success and the knowledge that excellence, when pursued with discipline and protected by preparation, could indeed triumph over privilege and corruption. The weekend passed in a blur of phone calls and news. Principal Whitmore left a voicemail congratulating Marcus, and mentioning that Riverside Prep was proud to have such an accomplished student representing the school, a message whose tone suggested political calculation rather than genuine pride. The local newspaper ran a story about Marcus's win, including a photo of him holding his trophy and a quote from Dr. Morrison praising his dedication and ingenuity. The article mentioned Riverside Prep prominently, which meant the school was now publicly invested in Marcus's success, whether Whitmore personally cared or not. Professor Walsh forwarded emails from colleagues at other universities who'd heard about the underwater ROV demonstration and wanted to know more about Marcus's work. The scholarship opportunities were materializing faster than Marcus could process them. 3 different summer programs, 2 with stipends that would let him send money home to his mother, and preliminary discussions about early admission to MIT's mechanical engineering program. Lisa Chen took Monday off work, using a precious vacation day to accompany Marcus to school, and together they walked through those bronze gates with a different energy than had marked Marcus's first day in September. The meeting with Principal Whitmore was scheduled for 8 a.m. in his office, and when Marcus and his mother arrived, they found Dr. Morrison already present, along with Brandon Ashworth, his father, Richard Ashworth, and a lawyer named David Fletcher, whose business card identified him as senior partner at Fletcher & Associates. The office felt crowded and tense, the adults arrayed around Whitmore's desk in configurations that suggested pre-existing alliances. Richard Ashworth wore a suit that cost more than 3 months of Lisa Chen's salary, and he had the kind of aging handsomeness that came from good genes and better health care. He looked at Marcus with the same calculating coldness his son had perfected, and he opened the meeting by suggesting that accusations against Brandon were overblown reactions to a clumsy accident, that teenage boys sometimes pushed each other without malicious intent, and that destroying a young man's future over adolescent horseplay seemed disproportionate. Fletcher the lawyer chimed in with references to witnesses who described the incident as accidental contact to the school's duty to protect all students, including those from prominent families, and to the potential liability Riverside Prep faced if they acted precipitously without proper investigation. Dr. Morrison produced her phone and played the video Professor Walsh had recorded. The footage showed Brandon positioning himself behind Marcus, showed the deliberate nature of the shove, showed the triumphant expression on Brandon's face in the seconds before he'd realized his sabotage had backfired. The video also showed Tyler Morrison and Chase Blackwell reacting with knowing smiles rather than surprise, suggesting conspiracy rather than accident. Morrison then produced her documentation of previous incidents: the vandalized bike, the contaminated chemistry lab, the harassing Instagram account, the locker break-ins, creating a pattern of behavior that demonstrated systematic targeting rather than isolated incidents. She concluded by stating that she had copies of all this evidence, that she'd provided it to Teresa Gonzalez at Connecticut Legal Aid, and that unless Riverside Prep took immediate and meaningful disciplinary action against Brandon and any accomplices, she would support Marcus in filing federal Title VI complaints that would trigger investigations capable of jeopardizing the school's nonprofit status and its ability to receive federal funding. The room went silent. Richard Ashworth's face had progressed through several shades of red, and he started to bluster about defamation and spurious accusations. But Fletcher put a hand on his arm and advised him quietly that video evidence was problematic from a legal defense perspective. Principal Whitmore looked like a man calculating political costs, weighing the value of Ashworth donations against the risk of federal investigations and public scandal. Brandon himself sat slumped in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by the dawning understanding that actions have consequences even for wealthy legacy students when evidence is incontrovertible and witnesses are willing to fight. Marcus watched this tableau and understood that this was what justice looked like in systems designed to protect privilege. not righteous punishment descending from on high, but grudging accountability extracted through documentation and legal threats, and the courage of individuals willing to sacrifice comfort for principle. Whitmore eventually proposed a resolution. Brandon would be suspended for 2 weeks, would be required to issue a public apology to Marcus, would lose his position as class president, and would be placed on disciplinary probation through graduation. Any additional incidents would result in expulsion regardless of family donations. Tyler Morrison, Chase Blackwell, and Jeremy Caldwell would receive similar suspensions and probation. Richard Ashworth objected that suspension would affect Brandon's college applications, that Harvard had already accepted him early admission, that 2 weeks of missed school could jeopardize his GPA. Morrison responded that maybe Brandon should have considered those consequences before engaging in a campaign of harassment and assault. Fletcher, the lawyer, advised his clients to accept the proposed resolution because the alternative, federal investigation and possible criminal charges for assault, would cause far more damage than a 2-week suspension. After 20 minutes of negotiation, Richard Ashworth agreed to the terms, and he left Whitmore's office with his son trailing behind like a defeated soldier retreating from battle. Fletcher remained to discuss legal releases and confidentiality agreements, but Lisa Chen interrupted to state clearly that they were not signing anything that prevented them from discussing what had happened, that Marcus had a right to tell his story, and that if Riverside Prep wanted to make this disappear, they should consider how their behavior had enabled months of harassment before being forced to act by outside legal pressure. The settlement wasn't everything Marcus would have chosen in a just world. A 2-week suspension felt insufficient for months of systematic cruelty, but it was more than most scholarship students achieved when confronting wealthy bullies backed by institutional protection. Dr. Morrison explained as they left the principal's office that sometimes incremental justice was the best you could accomplish in corrupt systems, that the real victory was establishing precedent and documentation that would protect future students. She also mentioned that she'd been contacted by the Connecticut Board of Education about testifying in an investigation into Riverside Prep's handling of harassment complaints, and that she'd agreed to cooperate fully regardless of personal cost. Marcus hugged her and understood that sometimes heroism looked like middle-aged teachers risking their pensions, that courage wasn't always dramatic, but could be found in the quiet decision to do the right thing, despite the price. His mother thanked Morrison with tears in her eyes, and the three of them walked out of the administrative building into December sunshine that felt warmer than the temperature suggested. That felt like a physical manifestation of burdens being lifted and futures being reclaimed. Brandon Ashworth's suspension became official that afternoon, and by evening, the story had spread through Riverside Prep's social networks like wildfire. Students who'd witnessed the pool incident, or who'd heard about the STEM Fair Award, or who'd simply been waiting for Brandon's invincibility to crack, suddenly found their voices and began sharing their own experiences with the Ashworth crew's cruelty. Instagram posts and group chats exploded with stories of harassment, theft, intimidation, and humiliation that had been individually dismissed as minor incidents, but collectively revealed a pattern of abuse that had poisoned the school's culture for years. Destiny Rodriguez posted about having her scholarship application sabotaged by Brandon, spreading rumors to the committee about her academic integrity. Kevin Park described being assaulted in the parking lot for refusing to let Brandon copy his calculus homework. A dozen other students contributed similar stories, and the accumulated weight of their testimony created a narrative that even Riverside Prep's administration couldn't ignore or dismiss. Principal Whitmore called an emergency assembly for Tuesday morning and delivered a speech about respect and dignity and the school's commitment to protecting all students, regardless of economic background. Words that would have meant more if they'd been accompanied by systemic changes. rather than just reactions to legal threats. The 2 weeks of Brandon's suspension were the most peaceful Marcus had experienced since arriving at Riverside Prep. He walked hallways without checking over his shoulder, ate lunch without anxiety about ambush, worked in the engineering lab without fear that his projects would be vandalized. Other students approached him with congratulations about the STEM fair, with questions about his ROV, with respect that felt genuine rather than performative. Teachers who'd previously overlooked him suddenly knew his name and asked about his college plans and wrote him recommendation letters that positioned him as a transformative student who'd overcome adversity through discipline and excellence. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story about his summer research opportunities, and the article mentioned briefly that he'd faced challenges at Riverside Prep that he'd handled with grace and determination, a diplomatic phrasing that nonetheless signaled to readers that not all students at elite prep schools benefited equally from their education. The article caught the attention of a producer at Connecticut Public Television who contacted Dr. Morrison about doing a segment on Marcus's work for their science education program, an opportunity that would give Marcus a platform to discuss marine robotics and also to subtly challenge assumptions about who gets to be an engineer and whose innovations get recognized. Brandon Ashworth returned to school in January, diminished. His letter jacket no longer attracted followers. His comments in class no longer received automatic agreement, and his presence at lunch tables was tolerated rather than celebrated. The public apology Whitmore had mandated was delivered in a mandatory assembly, and Brandon's reading of a statement clearly written by lawyers was wooden and insincere. But the fact that he had to stand in front of 600 students and acknowledge wrongdoing represented a destruction of the image he'd spent years cultivating. Tyler Morrison, Chase Blackwell, and Jeremy Caldwell similarly returned to school as marked individuals, their social capital depleted, their reputations damaged beyond repair by their association with behavior that had become publicly recognized as unacceptable. The power structure at Riverside Prep hadn't been revolutionized. Wealthy students still enjoyed advantages that scholarship kids would never access, but cracks had appeared in the facade, and students who'd previously accepted bullying as inevitable began to believe that resistance was possible and that documentation plus courage could sometimes force accountability even from protected elites. Marcus finished his junior year with a 4.0 GPA, multiple scholarship offers, and acceptance to MIT's summer research program studying autonomous underwater vehicles. Dr. Morrison retired at the end of the school year after securing promises from Whitmore that the school would implement formal anti-harassment procedures and would hire a Title IX coordinator to handle discrimination complaints. Professor Walsh published a paper on affordable marine robotics that featured Marcus's ROV design as a case study in cost-effective engineering, and the paper was cited in grant applications that funded similar projects at universities across the country. Lisa Chen finally took a weekend off and attended MIT's parent orientation session, where she met other families sending their children to elite universities, and realized that her son's excellence had earned him a seat at tables that had been closed to families like theirs for generations. Marcus spent that summer in Cambridge, working with graduate students and faculty who treated him as a colleague rather than a charity case, who valued his contributions based on merit rather than background, who demonstrated that institutions could operate on principles of excellence rather than privilege if they chose to do so. The criminal investigation into Brandon Ashworth's behavior never materialized despite Teresa Gonzalez's efforts, the local prosecutor declining to pursue charges for what he characterized as schoolyard conflicts rather than serious crimes. But Harvard University, alerted by an anonymous tip about Brandon's disciplinary record, conducted its own investigation and ultimately rescinded his early admission, citing concerns about character and judgment that suggested he wouldn't represent the university's values. Brandon ended up attending a respectable but less prestigious school, his path to effortless success disrupted by the consequences of his own choices. Tyler Morrison, Chase Blackwell, and Jeremy Caldwell followed similar trajectories. their college prospects dimmed by disciplinary records that followed them through application processes. Richard Ashworth attempted to use his influence to minimize the damage to his son's future, but discovered that video evidence of assault and systematic harassment had a way of spreading beyond his control, that the same social media networks his son had weaponized against Marcus could be turned against the Ashworth family when their behavior violated community standards. The family's reputation in Riverside never recovered, and within 2 years they'd relocated to a different town where their money could still purchase influence, but their name no longer commanded automatic deference. The following September, Marcus returned to Riverside Prep for his senior year as a different person. Not because he'd changed fundamentally, but because the school had been forced to recognize what he'd always been. He was named a National Merit Finalist, received early admission to MIT with a full scholarship, and was profiled in the school's promotional materials as evidence of Riverside Prep's commitment to nurturing talent regardless of background. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that the institution that had failed to protect him now wanted to claim credit for his success. But he understood that incremental change was how corrupt systems were reformed, not through sudden revolutionary transformation, but through thousands of small victories that established new precedents and new expectations. He spent his senior year mentoring younger scholarship students, teaching them about documentation and evidence gathering, explaining that excellence was necessary but insufficient without the courage to demand that institutions recognize and protect it. He started a STEM club that was open to all students, regardless of economic background, and that emphasized collaborative learning rather than competitive individualism. He worked with Dr. Morrison's replacement to establish formal procedures for reporting harassment and to create accountability mechanisms that didn't depend on victims having access to lawyers or influential advocates. Graduation day arrived in June with sunshine and ceremony. Marcus walked across the stage to receive his diploma and multiple awards: the STEM Excellence Award, the Character and Leadership Award, and the Principal's Medal for Outstanding Achievement. And he knew that every award represented not just his accomplishments, but also the systematic failures that had nearly prevented those accomplishments from being recognized. His mother sat in the audience crying and proud, and Dr. Morrison attended despite being retired because she wanted to witness the culmination of a battle they'd fought together. Professor Walsh was there representing Eastern Connecticut State University, and he explained to Lisa Chen that Marcus's work had inspired new curriculum development in accessible marine robotics and had demonstrated that excellence could emerge from unexpected places when talented students were given resources and mentorship. The ceremony concluded with graduates throwing caps into the air, and Marcus caught his and thought about his father, about the shadow box on their living room wall, about the lessons in discipline and preparation that had made survival possible and eventual triumph inevitable. He understood that his story wasn't exceptional, but rather a demonstration of what became possible when underdogs refused to accept defeat and when individuals chose courage over comfort. The summer before MIT found Marcus working on Cape Cod with a marine biology research group studying coastal erosion. His ROV design adapted for shallow water surveying. He lived in graduate student housing and earned enough money to send some home to his mother and to save toward college expenses that his scholarship didn't cover. He stayed in touch with Destiny Rodriguez and Kevin Park, both of whom had gained admission to strong universities and who credited Marcus's example with giving them confidence to demand fair treatment from institutions designed to favor others. He heard through the Riverside grapevine that Brandon Ashworth had dropped out of college after one semester, unable to navigate an environment where his name didn't protect him from consequences and where his behavior patterns were recognized as unacceptable rather than tolerated. Marcus felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy at this news. Brandon's destruction hadn't been his goal. Justice and accountability had been, and those had been achieved through documentation and courage, rather than revenge. Sometimes the best punishment for bullies was simply the requirement that they face the natural consequences of their actions, without the institutional protection they'd come to expect as birthright. MIT's campus in September felt like a homecoming to a place Marcus had never visited. He moved into his dormitory with his mother's help, his possessions still fitting in 2 duffel bags and a backpack because he'd learned that mobility was a survival skill for families without financial security. His roommate was a kid from California whose father was a tech executive, and they bonded over shared interests in robotics rather than divided by economic backgrounds. Marcus joined the Underwater Robotics Club and the Asian American Student Association and the First Generation College Students Group, finding community among people who understood different aspects of his experience. His professors treated him as a serious scholar from day one, challenging him intellectually without ever suggesting that his presence was charity or that his achievements were surprising given his background. He discovered what education felt like when institutions operated on meritocratic principles rather than preserving privilege, when excellence was recognized and rewarded regardless of surname or bank account. He maintained a relationship with Dr. Morrison, writing her monthly emails updating her on his progress and thanking her for the sacrifices she'd made to protect him. She wrote back that protecting him had been the easiest decision of her career, that courage was simply the act of choosing principles over convenience, and that watching him thrive at MIT was the greatest reward she could have imagined. During winter break of his freshman year, Marcus returned to Riverside and gave a talk at the public library about marine robotics and accessible STEM education. 40 people attended, including several Riverside prep students, both scholarship kids, and wealthy students who'd learned from Brandon Ashworth's fall that character mattered more than checking accounts. Marcus spoke about his father's influence, about the ROV project that had changed his trajectory, about the individuals who'd supported him when institutions failed, and about the importance of building systems so robust that sabotage becomes opportunity. He showed the video of Brandon pushing him into the pool and explained how that moment had demonstrated his ROV's resilience better than any planned presentation could have. The audience laughed at the irony and applauded the justice, and afterward, several young students approached to ask about pursuing engineering, despite coming from families without resources or connections. Marcus gave them his email address and his honest assessment that the path would be difficult but achievable if they were willing to work harder than their privileged peers, to document everything, to build support networks, and to never accept that money or family name determined human value. The years passed with the accelerated pace of college life, internships at marine technology companies, research projects that resulted in published papers, summers spent on research vessels studying ocean systems. Marcus graduated from MIT with honors and multiple job offers from companies that valued his combination of technical excellence and cost-conscious design philosophy. He chose to work for a nonprofit developing affordable underwater monitoring systems for environmental conservation, accepting a lower salary than commercial positions offered because his father had taught him that some missions were worth more than money. He bought his mother a house in a safe neighborhood with good schools, fulfilling the promise he'd made to himself during those months at Riverside Prep when survival had seemed uncertain. Lisa Chen retired from nursing after 30 years, her body worn out from decades of 12-hour shifts, but her spirit intact, and she spent her retirement volunteering at a community health clinic where she could help people without the profit pressures of corporate healthcare. Dr. Morrison sent Marcus a note when she saw his name listed as an author on a Nature article about coral reef monitoring, writing that she'd known from their first chemistry class that he was destined for important work, that his combination of brilliance and character was rare, and that she was grateful to have played a small part in protecting his potential when others had tried to destroy it. 10 years after the pool incident, Marcus received an unexpected email from Brandon Ashworth. The message was short and clearly difficult to write, an apology that acknowledged causing harm expressed regret without making excuses, and didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, but simply stated that Brandon had spent the past decade working on becoming a better person and wanted Marcus to know that his cruelty haunted him. Marcus read the email 3 times, recognizing both the courage required to send it and the inadequacy of words to repair damage that had shaped years of his life. He wrote back briefly, acknowledging the apology and expressing hope that Brandon had indeed changed, but making clear that forgiveness wasn't something he was prepared to offer, that some actions had consequences that persisted regardless of regret, and that the best amends Brandon could make was to become someone who protected vulnerable people rather than exploiting them. He never heard from Brandon again, but years later he saw a news story about a community college in Vermont where a donor named Brandon Ashworth had established a scholarship fund specifically for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Marcus allowed himself to believe that people could change, that cycles of cruelty could be broken, and that accountability plus time could sometimes produce redemption, though redemption didn't erase harm or obligate forgiveness. The story of what happened at Riverside Prep became a cautionary tale within Connecticut education circles, referenced in training sessions about institutional accountability, and cited in policy documents about protecting vulnerable students. The video of Brandon's push and Marcus's ROV recovery was used in engineering classes as an example of robust design principles, though the backstory of bullying and sabotage was often omitted in favor of focusing on technical excellence. Marcus occasionally gave talks at schools and conferences, always emphasizing that his success wasn't exceptional bootstrapping, but rather the result of preparation meeting opportunity, of mentors who chose courage over convenience, and of systematic documentation that forced institutions to act when they preferred inaction. He spoke honestly about the costs of fighting systems designed to protect privilege, about the exhaustion of constantly proving your worth in spaces that assumed your inferiority, about the trauma that persisted even after justice was achieved. But he also spoke about the importance of fighting anyway, about how change happened through thousands of small acts of resistance and courage, about how excellence could be a weapon when wielded with discipline and supported by community. What would you do if you witnessed bullying in your school or workplace? Would you document it, report it, intervene directly, or convince yourself it wasn't your problem? The question matters because systems of oppression persist not through the cruelty of villains, but through the silence of witnesses who choose comfort over conscience. Marcus's story demonstrates that fighting injustice requires more than individual courage. It requires documentation, allies willing to sacrifice their own security, and sustained pressure on institutions that profit from preserving the status quo. It shows that excellence alone is insufficient if systems are designed to ignore or suppress it. But that excellence combined with evidence and advocates who refuse to be silenced can force even corrupt institutions to bend toward accountability. The pool incident at the STEM fair became legendary not because Marcus's ROV survived sabotage, though that was impressive, but because his survival and ultimate triumph revealed what becomes possible when underdogs refuse to accept defeat and when individuals choose justice over convenience. Share this story with anyone who's ever felt powerless against systems that seem designed to crush them, with teachers deciding whether to protect vulnerable students or preserve their own security, with parents trying to guide children through institutions that operate on principles of privilege rather than merit. Remember that Brandon Ashworth's downfall began not when Marcus fought back violently, but when Marcus and his allies documented everything, refused to be silenced, and forced institutions to choose between accountability and exposure. Remember that Dr. Morrison's courage lay not in dramatic gestures, but in steady advocacy, even when it threatened her pension, in standing with Marcus when it would have been easier to look away. Remember that Lisa Chen's strength manifested through working night shifts to keep her son enrolled in a school that failed to protect him, through believing in his excellence when institutions dismissed it, through teaching him that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you carried yourself through spaces designed to remind you that you didn't belong. Subscribe to see more stories about underdogs who refuse to stay down, about the power of preparation and documentation, about how justice sometimes arrives not as dramatic intervention, but as the natural consequence of bullies finally facing accountability for their actions. Like this story, if you believe that character matters more than bank accounts, that institutions can be forced to change when brave individuals refuse to accept corruption as inevitable, and that the best revenge against those who tried to destroy you is becoming so excellent that they're forced to watch your success from the margins they tried to confine you to. Comment below about times you've witnessed or experienced bullying, about adults who chose courage over convenience, about the difference between empty apologies and genuine accountability. Remember Marcus Chen not as a victim who survived, but as a strategist who documented, prepared, and built systems so robust that sabotage became the very demonstration of excellence his adversaries tried to prevent. And remember that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in protecting yourself and those who come after you from systems designed to crush anyone who challenges. Established hierarchies of power and privilege